I stood there smiling, fingers still wrapped around the edge of the podium as the laughter faded. Just a desk filler, Greg had said. My retirement night, and that was the legacy he handed me. Forks clinked, someone coughed, and across the banquet hall, Richard stared down at his napkin like truth was something better ignored. 22 years, hundreds of shifts covered, thousands of hours swallowed. And now, a joke. Not even cruel, just dismissive. I wasn't furious. Not yet. I was awake. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The banquet hall glowed with soft amber light, all polished silverware and folded linen napkins. From the stage, the clinking of glasses had just settled when Janet felt her pulse start to climb. Her speech sat printed on the podium, hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges. Rows of tables stretched before her, faces she'd worked with for 22 years. Some smiling warmly, some politely detached, others already halfway into their second drink. And then Greg spoke. She was just a desk filler. A few people laughed. Thin, awkward, brittle. The kind of laughter people offer when they're unsure whether it's safe to stay silent. Janet blinked. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her throat closed in that particular way it had always done when someone in the office said something that grazed too close to humiliation. The heat started low in her chest and spread outward, up her neck, into her ears. Richard, her former supervisor and the man who should have said something, anything, just looked down at the tablecloth. He smoothed the corner with his thumb. Didn't look up. Didn't look at her. Janet's smile held, but her knuckles had turned white on the edge of the podium. Greg leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a smirk playing on the edge of his mouth like he'd just scored the winning point at some invisible office game only he thought they were playing. And then Diane, Janet's only real friend left at regional, caught her eye. From 2 tables over. No sound. Just a look. She mouthed it slowly. Don't let it go. Janet's breath caught. In a blink, she saw it all. 22 years of showing up early, of covering shifts when the junior reps called out, of coaching interns Greg forgot he hired, of surviving 3 department restructures, of smiling through 5 Christmas parties where her contributions were folded under the phrase team effort. She had taken it, all of it, without complaint, because she'd believed that hard work counted for something, that her time, her loyalty, meant she'd earned at least a shred of respect. But not to Greg. To Greg, she'd always been invisible, just a desk filler. Janet adjusted the mic. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, she began, her voice calm, smooth, too smooth. She hated the way it trembled underneath that false polish. Retirement's a strange word. Feels like someone else's life. Someone older, quieter. A few heads nodded politely. Forks clinked against plates. But I guess when you've spent over 2 decades in the same chair. Her eyes flicked to Greg just for a moment. People think they know you, think they can sum you up. Someone shifted in their seat. The room had gone still, the way it does when tension sneaks in but hasn't yet been named. Janet smiled gently, her gaze sweeping past Richard, who still hadn't looked up. It's funny. We spend so long trying to be dependable, to be steady. We think if we're just good enough, the right people will see us. But sometimes the ones who should have seen you never looked. Greg's smirk faded. Not fully, but enough. The audience stirred. I wasn't loud. I didn't take credit where I shouldn't. I didn't need to. I thought the work spoke for itself. Maybe that was naive. Janet's voice stayed level, but there was a new edge to it now, like a piano wire pulled just a little too tight. Diane watched her, nodding once, just barely. I've been called efficient, organized, reliable. Words meant to sound like praise but used like paperweights. Heavy. Dull. A small chuckle came from the back. Someone who got it. Janet leaned in slightly. But I've also been called the reason client retention held steady during our worst fiscal year. The one who red-flagged the Northern States account before it went belly up. The one who trained 2/3 of the current department heads. She paused, eyes sweeping the room. This time, no one laughed. So I guess I'll leave you all with this. Maybe next time, think twice before calling someone a desk filler. You might be sitting at a desk they built. She stepped back from the mic. The applause started slowly, then spread. Hesitant at first, then full-bodied. Genuine. Greg didn't clap. Richard clapped, but it was late. 2 beats too late. Janet walked off the stage, past the rows of tables, head high. Her hands were still shaking, but her spine had never felt straighter. She reached the back hallway leading toward the coat room when Diane appeared beside her, grinning like she'd just watched someone win a courtroom drama. Damn, Janet. But Janet barely heard her, because just past Diane's shoulder, she saw Greg getting up from his table, alone, his face unreadable. And then he turned and headed not for the bar or the bathroom, but toward the private staff corridor, the one leading to the executive offices. Janet frowned, heart starting to pound again, but this time, not from shame. Something was off. Janet's porch light flickered as she stepped onto the creaking wood boards, heels in one hand, clutch purse tucked under her arm. The air was cooler now, sharper than it had been when she left that morning wearing soft coral lipstick and hoping to feel proud. Instead, she felt wired, not in a caffeinated way, in a surgical way, clean, cold, focused. Inside, the living room was dim, her answering machine blinking red with 2 messages she didn't bother checking. She stepped out of her heels and walked barefoot across the wood floor toward the den at the back of the house. The room smelled faintly of cedar, paper, and old printer toner, a scent that had lived here longer than her ex-husband ever had. In the far corner stood the tall beige filing cabinet. 4 drawers, labeled in her own meticulous handwriting, faded now. HR plus, policies, client accounts, internal emails, red flags. Janet crouched, tugged the bottom drawer open, and ran her fingers across years of manila folders, tabbed, dated, cataloged. Not copies, originals. Back in 2008, she'd been tasked with tidying up the digital archives. Greg's idea of tidying meant mass deletions. Janet's meant backing up everything, not because she was paranoid, but because she understood how incompetence could bury the wrong person. She pulled a thick folder labeled Greg, Allocations 2015-2017, and laid it on the desk. Then another, Q4 bonus memos, denied. And another, internal complaint, retaliation, JS. She flipped through them quickly now, brain racing ahead of her hands. December 12, 2016. Greg had rerouted a vendor contract to a buddy's firm at double the cost. March 3, 2018. Greg ignored an audit recommendation from compliance, filed it as reviewed without action. August 20th, 2019. A quiet HR complaint about Greg cornering a temp in the copy room, buried, dismissed. The deeper she went, the more her anger crystallized into something colder. Greg had always been careless with paperwork. Lazy, even. What he didn't realize, what he never cared to realize, was that Janet had always done his job for him when it got too complicated. Quietly, invisibly. Now, that invisibility had a weight and teeth. She opened her desk drawer and took out a legal pad, flipping it to a clean page. Began jotting bullet points, dates, names, cross-references. By the time her hand began to cramp, the paper was half full. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Diane. Janet answered, putting the call on speaker. Are you okay? Diane asked. No pleasantries. I'm fine, Janet said, though her voice was low, taut. That thing Greg did, walking off like that after your speech. What the hell was that about? He went into the executive corridor, past the security door. Diane paused. You think he was trying to erase something? I think Greg's smart in all the wrong ways, Janet said, and dumb in the ones that matter. There was silence on the line as Diane seemed to let that hang. I'm looking through the records I saved, Janet said finally, and there's enough here to get him fired 3 times over. A long exhale from Diane, then, you know what I'm gonna say. Janet said nothing. Talk to a lawyer. I just retired 3 hours ago. And you just found dynamite in your file cabinet. You want to burn him down, you need to do it right. Clean. Janet looked down at the documents spread across her desk like a forensic crime board. She thought of Greg's smirk, of Richard's silence, of the applause that came 2 beats too late. Do you still have that guy you used when legal threatened to bury you over your leave time? Yeah. Still in Atlanta, Diane said. You want me to call him? No, Janet said, standing slowly, staring at the open drawer. I want to go see him myself. She clicked the phone off. Janet walked to the kitchen, opened a fresh pad of Post-its, and scrawled 2 words she hadn't said out loud in years: leverage inventory. She stuck it on the fridge, next to a magnet shaped like a smiling sun, something her daughter gave her 15 years ago. It looked ridiculous now, but she left it there. She returned to the den, sat down, and began scanning each page into her encrypted backup drive, one she'd never used until now. The final document she scanned was a memo with her name on it, a denial for a promotion she'd been unofficially promised 3 times. Greg's signature was at the bottom, stamped over it in red. Position eliminated. She stared at the date. It was the same week she took 2 unpaid days to bury her father. Her hands stilled. The room went silent, except for the soft hum of the scanner. Then she opened a new tab on her laptop. Searched. Employment lawyers, plus corporate fraud, plus Atlanta, and clicked. The diner hadn't changed in 20 years. Same peeling checkerboard floor. Same laminated menus so worn the corners curled like old photographs. Same waitress with half-moon glasses and a voice like cigarette gravel. Janet slid into the vinyl booth just as Diane waved over from the opposite side, already sipping from a mug of too dark coffee. Thought you'd chicken out, Diane said with a grin. Janet pulled off her coat, folding it neatly beside her. Not in the mood to hide anymore. Diane raised her mug like a toast. Now that's the Janet I remember. They ordered the usual: 2 black coffees, 1 slice of cherry pie, extra whipped cream, and for a few moments they let the silence breathe between them. The only soundtrack was the clink of plates and the low hum of Springsteen from the jukebox. Then Diane leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice lowering. So, how bad is it? Janet opened her tote bag and slid a folder across the table. Just one. The others stayed locked at home. This one, though, it was enough. Diane opened it, scanned the first few pages. Her smile faded. The smirk she always wore like armor melted into something harder, colder. Jesus Christ, she muttered. He rerouted funds. That's federal. Janet nodded slowly. There's more. That's just the preview reel. Diane shut the folder, her jaw working as she stared past Janet out the window, where a father in a Little League hoodie wrangled 2 kids into a minivan. Greg always walked around like he owned the building, she said. And you know what? Half the time, people let him. They still do, Janet said, sipping her coffee. He's protected. He's good at pretending he's in control. Delegates the mess down, takes the credit up. Expose him, Diane said flatly. Now, before he erases more. Janet looked down at her hands. Steady now. That was new. I have everything I need, she said. Emails, policy violations, financial records, memos he signed without reading. Diane tapped her finger against the folder. You sure you want to play this game? I don't want to, Janet said, but I'm going to. For a beat, neither of them spoke. Then Diane sat back and laughed. A low, rich sound that drew a few glances from the corner booth. What? Harold owes me a favor. Janet blinked. Harold? Harold Gutman. Legal affairs. You remember? He handled my FMLA appeal when they tried to write me off after my surgery. Janet stared at her. You said you threatened to go to the press. I did, Diane said, and he backed off. Helped me. Quietly. You think he'd help me? I think, Diane said slowly. He still hates Greg, and I think he'd love to drop a stone in that smug little pond. Janet leaned forward. You still have his number? I have his direct line, and his burner, in case he needs off the record. That stopped Janet. Wait, you've been in touch? Not since last year. But he told me if I ever had a mess someone needed help cleaning up, to call. Janet looked out the window. Cars moved slowly through the gray morning light, a school bus stopping at the corner to collect yawning kids with oversized backpacks. She thought about the promotion Greg stole, the contract reroutes, the temp in the copy room. She thought about what it meant to sit on proof and do nothing. I'll call him, she said quietly, but not until I know exactly what I want. Diane raised an eyebrow. You don't want revenge? I want consequences. Diane gave a short nod. Good, because Harold plays chess, not checkers. The waitress dropped the bill. Diane grabbed it without asking. As they slid out of the booth, Diane grabbed Janet's coat and handed it to her. You're not a desk filler, she said. You're the one who held the walls up while everyone else played executive. Janet didn't reply. She just slipped her arms into the sleeves, the coat suddenly feeling like armor. As they stepped outside into the brisk Georgia air, Janet's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, but then the message icon lit up. She hesitated, thumb hovering, then played it on speaker. Janet, this is Richard. Look, I think you should know. Greg was in the building this morning. Something's going on. Something you need to see. Janet froze. Diane turned to her. What the hell does that mean? Janet didn't answer, because somewhere, deep in her gut, she already knew. Greg wasn't just covering tracks. He was building something. The elevator to the 15th floor of the Peachtree Financial Center smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and burned coffee. Janet stood near the mirrored panel, clutching her leather tote bag so tightly the straps creaked. The soft hum of the cables rose with every floor until the doors opened to a corridor lined with framed case wins, settlements, injunctions, quiet victories. Nobody but insiders knew had even happened. She followed the etched brass plaque, Harold Gutman, attorney at law, and paused at the glass door. Inside, the office was not sleek corporate marble but an eclectic mix. Persian rug over hardwood, books stacked horizontally and vertically across floor-to-ceiling shelves, a chessboard set mid-game on a side table. The blinds were half-drawn, letting in stripes of Atlanta sunlight. Harold looked up from behind his desk as she entered. His hair was silver now, cropped close. And his tie was loosened like he'd been in court all morning. He had the kind of expression that said he'd seen everything and still wasn't impressed. Janet, he said, standing to shake her hand. It's been a long time. Diane sends her regards, Janet replied, sliding the tote onto the chair opposite his desk. She said you might help. He gestured for her to sit. Let's see what we're dealing with. Janet reached into the tote and pulled out a thick binder wrapped in a rubber band. She set it down between them. It landed with a solid, satisfying weight. Harold raised an eyebrow. That's not a folder. That's a torpedo. He snapped the band off and opened to the first tab. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the turning of pages. Vendor reroute, double cost, internal complaint buried. His voice was quiet but clipped, like an accountant reading off a ledger of sins. This is your old boss? Janet nodded. Greg Mercer, regional director. 22 years of cutting corners while I cleaned up the mess. Harold turned another page. His eyebrows climbed. Ignored an audit recommendation. Falsified review signatures. Holy hell. He looked up. You kept originals? Yes, and digital backups. Good. Originals speak louder. Janet sat very still, watching him work. In this office, she didn't feel like the invisible one. She felt like someone holding a lit match over a dry field. Harold closed the binder halfway, thumb resting on the edge. You realize what you're holding here? I think so, Janet said. Her voice didn't shake. You're sitting on breach of fiduciary duty evidence, potential fraud, retaliation claims. At least 3 separate whistleblower statutes apply. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. If this goes to the right agency, Greg's career isn't just over, he could be criminally charged. Janet's eyes didn't flicker. Good. Harold tilted his head. Most people come in here shaking. You're not. I already did my shaking, Janet said. For 22 years. A faint smile ghosted his mouth. All right, here's the reality. You can file with the Department of Labor or the SEC, depending on which contracts were federally funded. But you also have leverage for a private suit. Wrongful denial of promotion, retaliation, constructive discharge. I don't want hush money, Janet said. I want a record. Something permanent. Then we'll do it clean, Harold said. Anonymous tip to regulators. Once they open the investigation, your name won't matter. He tapped the binder. You'll still need protection. This kind of thing gets ugly. Janet sat forward, hands flat on the desk. Ugly I can handle. What I can't handle is him walking away again. Harold studied her for a long moment, then reached across and closed the binder with a soft thump. I'll draft the initial filing tonight. We'll position you as a whistleblower. No settlement talks until the hammer drops. Understood? She nodded. Understood. He rose, walking to the bookshelf, pulling down a thin navy volume, Whistleblower Protections Annotated. You'll also want to keep your digital backups in a safe location, off-site if possible. And if you get any calls you don't recognize, don't answer. Let them go to voicemail. Janet's phone buzzed in her bag as if on cue. Unknown number. She ignored it. Harold gave her a look. That fast? She shrugged. Maybe, or maybe just a robocall. He returned to his desk. Either way, it starts now. Once I move, we don't stop until it's done. Janet stood, feeling the weight of the tote bag lighter now that the binder was gone. She glanced at the chessboard on the side table. White queen poised mid-attack over a black knight. Play to win, huh? She said softly. Harold followed her gaze. Always. She turned to leave, but as her hand reached the door, Harold's phone rang. A low, insistent buzz. He glanced at the caller ID, then at her. Speak of the devil, he muttered. Janet paused. Who? He hesitated, then flipped the screen for her to see. It was Greg Mercer, calling Harold directly. Janet was boxing up the last of her desk when she heard the heavy thud of expensive shoes behind her. No knock, no greeting, just a presence. She didn't have to turn. Janet, Greg said, too loud for the quiet hum of the office. Still playing house in here? She took a breath and faced him with slow precision. He stood in her doorway like a realtor casing a property he thought he already owned. Gray suit pressed sharp, Rolex just peeking from beneath his cuff. You're early, she said. My retirement week's not over until Friday. He strolled in without waiting for permission, brushing past a half-packed box of framed certificates. Yeah, well, figured I'd get a head start. Thought you might leave a few good pens behind. Janet gestured toward the filing cabinet. Help yourself. Greg laughed like he'd just shared a private joke with a subordinate who knew better than to laugh back. You know, he said, walking to the window and pulling the blinds halfway. I've been told they're eyeing me for the corner office. Big changes coming. You picked a good time to bail. Janet set a mug of coffee on her desk. Cream, no sugar. Still how you take it. He looked surprised. Took the mug anyway. Didn't think you'd still bother. I'm consistent, she said, settling into her chair like it was still hers. Even when people don't deserve it. Greg smiled over the rim of his mug. You're not mad about the banquet thing, are you? I mean, desk filler? Come on, it was a joke. People laughed. Janet smiled politely. Not really. He blinked, thrown off by her calm. Right, well, water under the bridge. He looked around the office like a man taking inventory. They'll probably tear this place apart once I move in. Update everything. Start fresh. Janet swiveled slightly in her chair, watching him with something close to curiosity. Start fresh, she repeated. That must be nice. Greg wandered toward the tall filing cabinet in the corner. He tapped it twice with his knuckles. Still got these old things? Everything's digital now, Janet. You know that, right? She tilted her head. Some things are better left in hard copy. He snorted, sipping his coffee. You always were sentimental. She just watched him, unmoving. The way you watch a storm move across the horizon, too far to hit yet, but close enough to study its shape. He finished the coffee and set the mug down with a loud clink. Anyway, good luck with retirement. Maybe take up gardening or whatever people do when they don't matter anymore. Janet smiled as she stood. Thanks for stopping by. Greg gave her a mock salute, then turned and walked out as confidently as he had come in. Didn't look back. She waited until his footsteps faded down the hall, then moved to the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer. The mug he used was already fingerprinted. And her digital backup drive? Safely off-site. She was 10 moves ahead. Her phone buzzed. Harold Gutman, E1, missed call. 1, new voicemail. She played it on speaker as she pulled out a folder labeled Executive Comp Reports. Unverified. Harold's voice came through low but urgent. Janet, we're good. I mean really good. I just spoke with a contact at the Office of Inspector General. Based on what you gave me, we've got misappropriation of funds, falsified filings, and 2 clear retaliation patterns. They're opening a file. This isn't internal anymore. It's federal. Do not talk to Greg again. Call me. Janet closed the folder. Her hands didn't tremble. Outside her office, someone laughed too loudly at the front desk. Greg's voice, still strutting. She pressed delete on the voicemail. Not because she didn't need it, but because she'd already saved it to a private drive. Then she opened her laptop and created a new folder on her desktop. Greg Mercer, Fallout. She stared at it a long moment, then dragged in 3 documents. Vendor kickback summary, whistleblower statutes, annotated. Email thread, denied promotion, suspicious timing. She was building her war chest. The office intercom beeped. Janet, the receptionist said, voice brittle. You've got someone here to see you, won't give their name. Said you'd know what it's about. Janet's stomach dropped an inch, not out of fear but the sudden clarity of timing. Send them back, she said, already locking her screen. As the door creaked open again, she stood. Back straight, voice even. She was ready. The county records office still smelled like toner and coffee burned 3 hours too long. Janet stepped inside, the door's dull bell chiming as she crossed the threshold into a space that hadn't changed since the Clinton administration. Green linoleum floors, brown metal cabinets, and posters about fraud prevention curling at the corners from sun exposure. Behind the counter, A familiar face looked up from a stack of manila folders. "Janet Kessler," said Linda Perez, grinning. "Now this is a surprise." Janet returned the smile, genuine for the first time in days. "Hey, Linda. Didn't think you'd still be holding down the fort." Linda scoffed. "They'll have to drag me out in handcuffs or a hearse." Janet leaned against the counter, her tote bag resting against her hip like a satchel full of secrets. "Actually, I was hoping you could help me with a few notarizations. Originals. And I need the chain of custody airtight." Linda straightened, her smirk fading into something more serious. "Official business?" Janet opened the tote and pulled out a slim leather folder. Inside, 4 documents, copies of the original files from Greg's tenure, were clipped and tabbed. Each one had the kind of signature that, in the wrong context, became evidence. "Very official," Janet said softly. Linda reached for her notary stamp. "Whose throat are we cutting today?" "Just making sure the truth doesn't go missing." Linda nodded like she understood more than she was saying. "Let's get to work." For the next 30 minutes, the two women sat side by side at the laminate counter, Linda checking signatures, Janet cross-referencing with her digital drive, the silence broken only by the solid thump of the notary stamp and the hum of the copy machine. It felt like closure being built in real time, paper, ink, and law. When the last document was signed, sealed, and certified, Linda slipped it into a fireproof envelope and slid it back across the counter. "You're covered now," she said. "Chain of custody begins here. These copies are legal, traceable, and if anyone tries to make them disappear, they won't," Janet said, "because they're already stored in 3 separate encrypted clouds." Linda smirked. "You always were the type to back up your backups." Janet stood, the weight in her chest feeling lighter for the first time in weeks. "Thanks, Linda. Seriously." "Go fry that bastard," Linda said, grabbing a new stack of intake forms without looking up. "Just don't forget to call me when the court case goes public. I want a front row seat." Janet left the records office with her scarf pulled tight and her boots crunching over a dusting of sleet on the sidewalk. The air had shifted. Cooler, crisper. Autumn in Dallas was finally surrendering to winter, and somewhere in that slow breath of cold was a sense that change had already begun. She pulled into the diner lot a few minutes later and spotted Diane through the window, already in their usual booth, waving like they were teenagers again. Inside, the warmth hit her fast. Diane had ordered 2 slices of pie and 2 black coffees before Janet even sat down. "Well?" Diane asked, already grinning. Janet pulled the certified envelope from her coat pocket and set it between them. "Stamped, notarized, filed, and backed up in 3 states." Diane raised her fork like a sword. "To the first brick in Greg Mercer's fall." They clinked forks over cherry pie. For a long moment the world was just sweet filling and the soft scratch of a booth cushion under familiar weight. Then Diane tilted her head toward the window. "You seen that?" Janet turned. Outside, snow was falling. Soft, quiet flakes dusting the tops of parked cars and blanketing the sidewalks. A rare sight for Dallas this early in the season. "Huh," Janet murmured. "Haven't seen that in years." "It's a sign," Diane said, nodding. "A cosmic clean slate." Janet let the idea settle into her chest like warm tea. But before she could say anything, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She nearly let it go, but then it buzzed again, twice. She picked up. "Janet Kessler?" a clipped male voice asked. "Yes." "This is Agent Ryan Cole, Department of Labor. We need to talk. In person." Janet sat up straighter. Diane froze across the table. "About what?" Janet asked calmly. The pause on the other end was brief, but loaded. "About a sealed severance clause in a non-disclosure agreement from 2017, he said. "Signed by you and Greg Mercer." Janet's breath caught. She hadn't signed an NDA, had she? I never agreed to any. It was filed under your name, the agent said, and it's active, meaning what you're doing right now may already be in breach. Janet felt the air go thin. Diane reached across the table, eyes wide. Ms. Kessler, the agent said, you need to come in. Janet sat curled into the corner of her couch, a wool blanket draped across her legs, a steaming mug of chamomile resting on the side table beside her. Outside, snow still drifted through the Dallas evening like someone had shaken the sky gently and let the flakes fall where they pleased. Her laptop glowed against the dim room, the fireplace casting soft light across the photos on her mantel, her daughter's graduation, her mother's Sunday garden, the office holiday party from 2009 where no one had noticed Janet standing in the back. She clicked open LinkedIn. Greg Mercer's face greeted her like a slap in the dark. His latest post sat at the top of the feed, time-stamped just 3 hours earlier. Exciting news ahead. Honored to be considered for Regional VP. Looking forward to this next chapter. Leadership. Kshatrish growth. Shah gratitude. The photo attached was taken in his office, staged like a campaign ad. Suit jacket slung over the chair, skyline view behind him, one hand on the desk, the other tucked casually into his pocket, as if he hadn't just forged her signature on an NDA she never agreed to. The comments were already pouring in. Well deserved, Greg. You've earned it, boss. Couldn't happen to a better guy. Janet scrolled slowly. Her jaw didn't clench. Her fingers didn't twitch. Instead, she reached for her mug, took a sip, and clicked the small gray button marked Like, a single thumb beneath a sea of praise. Within minutes, her inbox began to hum. A message from Carol R., the former receptionist. Did you see Greg's post? Please tell me it's a joke. One from Martin Leary, who'd been on her team for 8 years. Is he actually getting promoted? After everything? Another from someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Just one line. Janet, what is happening? She stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box, then typed, just wait, and clicked send. The fire crackled behind her. A wind whispered against the old windows. She leaned back, crossing one ankle over the other, calm settling into her bones like she'd earned it. Because she had. Just then, the front door creaked open. Diane didn't knock anymore. She came in like she had keys to the place, half invited, half declared. She was holding 2 coffees and a plastic bag with what looked suspiciously like pecan muffins. You see it? She asked, sliding out of her coat before Janet even looked up. Front and center on my feed, Janet said. Diane snorted. He hashtagged gratitude. That's rich. She dropped onto the couch beside her, handed over a coffee and peered at the screen. You reply? Janet sipped. Told them to wait. Diane chuckled. He has no idea. Not a clue. He's polishing the brass on a ship with a hole in it. Janet gave the faintest smile. Let him. They sat in companionable silence, warmth cocooning them as the snow built up softly outside. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old radiator hissed to life. Janet's phone buzzed. Ian, new email, Harold Gutman. She opened it. Subject, case status, immediate developments. Janet, confirmed. DOL accepted our submission. Civil investigators have flagged Greg's financial activity for internal review. You're protected under federal whistleblower provisions as of this morning. Keep everything quiet. No responses. No comments. Let the formal process work. Next step. You may be subpoenaed as a material witness. Harold Janet closed the laptop. She didn't say anything at first. Just picked up her knitting needles from the basket near her feet. Navy wool already halfway through a scarf she hadn't had time to finish since her daughter's first year of college. The motion came naturally, her fingers working with quiet purpose as Diane watched. You always start knitting when you're planning something, Diane said, College application week, your divorce, Greg's first merger. I'm not planning, Janet said calmly. No, I'm preparing. Diane nodded like that meant more than it sounded. Janet kept knitting, loop after loop sliding from needle to needle with rhythmic precision. Calm, measured, mechanical. Then her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, voicemail received. She clicked it, half listening until she heard the voice. Janet, it's Richard. I don't know what Greg did exactly, but he's in full panic mode. He's shredding files. Had it wipe his email archives. You need to be careful. He's not just scared. He's furious. Janet didn't blink. She set the yarn gently aside, then reached for the burner phone in the drawer she hadn't touched in 6 years. The burner phone vibrated twice on the oak coffee table, its screen casting a dim light against the amber glow of the fireplace. Janet picked it up with a steady hand. No contact name, just a timestamp. 9:42 p.m. and a voicemail. She pressed play. Janet, it's Greg. Look, I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but whatever little fantasy you're chasing, it's over. I don't know what Diane filled your head with, but you're messing with the wrong people now. So here's some advice. Retire. For real this time. And leave it alone. Click. That was it. No apology, no pretense, just veiled threats dressed in a silk tie. She rewound and played it again. Same smug tone, same bored authority, like he was scolding a junior associate for daring to question his brilliance. From the couch, Diane was half sitting up now, coffee long gone cold in her lap. That son of a bitch, she said. Did he really just tell you to… what? Retire better? Janet muted the phone and forwarded the audio file to Harold, marking it as case evidence, threatening tone. I'm saving that one, she said, tone cool as glass. Diane grinned. You should frame it. Gold plate the waveform. Hang it next to your certificates. Janet exhaled slowly, placing the burner on the table beside her yarn. He thinks this is just office politics, that this can be won with bravado. Yeah, Diane said. That's always been his problem. Mistaking noise for power. Janet stood, stretched, and walked to the kitchen, pouring the last of the coffee into her mug. She didn't flinch. She didn't pace. Her hands moved the way they did when balancing spreadsheets or organizing annual reports. Measured, unhurried. Her phone buzzed again. This time, her personal one. A new email from Harold. Subject: voicemail received. Legal use confirmed. Janet got the audio. Tone, language, and timestamp make it admissible under whistleblower retaliation protections. Good leverage. Keep logging everything. We're close now. Harold. She returned to the living room, showing the message to Diane before setting her phone face down. We're close, she echoed softly. As Diane stood to gather her things, the doorbell rang. Both women paused. You expecting someone? Diane asked, reaching toward her purse like it might contain pepper spray. Janet shook her head once. She moved to the door, checking the peephole. It wasn't Greg. It wasn't a stranger. It was Richard. Wearing a down vest over his usual button-down, shifting from foot to foot like a teenager waiting for a parent to open the door after curfew. Janet cracked the door open. Richard? He offered a sheepish smile. Hi, sorry to drop in like this. I was driving by and I guess I've been meaning to talk to you. She opened the door wider but didn't step aside. What about? Richard scratched the back of his neck. Lunch? Maybe? Tomorrow. I owe you at least that. Janet raised an eyebrow. Lunch? He nodded, eyes flicking briefly toward Diane, then back to Janet. I know I didn't say anything at the banquet. I should have. I froze. And then, after that call I left, I realized you're in the middle of something serious, and I want to help. Or at least, not be one more silent coward in your life. Behind her, Diane folded her arms, watching like a bouncer at a velvet rope. Janet didn't answer right away. She studied Richard's face, creased from years behind spreadsheets, eyes tired but not dishonest. For years he had been the quiet one in meetings, the guy who avoided conflict by slipping into data. But now, under the porch light, he looked like a man who knew something was catching up to all of them. "Fine," Janet said, "but we don't talk like old friends. We talk like people with a clock ticking between them." Richard nodded solemnly. "Understood." She gave him a time and closed the door gently. Diane arched an eyebrow. That was unexpected. Janet walked back to the couch, picked up her knitting, and resumed her stitch count like nothing had happened. "I'm done waiting for people to do the right thing," she said. "And now?" Janet looped a final row, then looked up. "Now I give them the chance to make it right. Or burn with him." They met at Beasley's Cafe, the kind of small-town lunch spot that hadn't updated its wallpaper since Reagan was in office. Red vinyl booths, chalkboard specials, ceiling fans spinning slow over the low murmur of town gossip and clinking glassware. Janet chose a booth against the wall where she could see the door. She ordered iced tea, unsweetened, with lemon, and waited. Richard arrived 7 minutes late, visibly sweating under a blazer that didn't quite fit him anymore. He held a manila folder like a life preserver. "Thanks for meeting," he said, sliding into the booth with too much effort for someone who used to jog 5Ks. Janet nodded, but didn't smile. "You said you had something important." Richard took a breath. "I started looking. After your call. After Greg's little meltdown." He opened the folder and laid out a set of printouts between them. "I pulled up archived HR logs, old stuff, things Greg never submitted to legal." Janet leaned in, gaze sharp. The documents were incident reports. Half completed, never signed off. One with her name. Two with names she recognized from the Northern States collapse. One that just said, "Verbal abuse. Intern, summer 2019, with no follow-up, no resolution." "I thought these had been dismissed," she said. "That they were baseless." That's what Greg told the board. Richard shook his head. "They were never even filed. He kept them in a private folder marked pending, then told HR they were resolved verbally." "And legal bought that?" Janet asked, her voice low and steady. "They didn't know," Richard said, "because he never told them. He rerouted the compliance pings into a dummy inbox I helped him set up back in 2016. He swallowed. "I thought it was just for junk audit alerts." Janet's fingers tapped against the cold glass of her tea. "Richard," she said quietly, "do you understand what this means?" He nodded, barely. "It means the company didn't just ignore complaints. It never saw them. And if that NDA he filed under my name was buried the same way." She let that thought hang like a noose. Just then, her phone buzzed. A message from Harold. "Update. Confirmed. Greg rerouted mandatory reporting emails. That's obstruction. Federal statute." She turned the phone so Richard could see it. He paled. "Obstruction?" "Of a federally protected reporting channel," she clarified. "It doesn't get much worse." Richard looked like a man watching his entire retirement plan collapse in real time. He sank deeper into the booth, tugging at his collar. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear. I didn't know how deep it went." "You helped build the wall he hid behind," Janet said, still calm. "You're just lucky I'm not tearing it down with you inside." Diane arrived just then, sliding into the booth next to Janet like a sniper settling into her post. "Afternoon," she said, glancing at the papers. "Oof, that looks bad." Richard tried to smile, failed. "I didn't know." "We heard," Diane said. "So did the Department of Labor." He turned toward Janet, eyes pleading. "What do I do now?" "You cooperate," she said. "You put your name on a statement, you validate the dates, and you start remembering everything Greg asked you to help clean up over the last 5 years." Diane reached for a fry from Janet's plate. Because if you don't, she said, chewing, you'll go down as the guy who helped cover it all. Richard dropped his gaze. I'll help. Janet nodded once, then reached for her tea. Outside, the clouds were thinning, sunlight beginning to crack through like a verdict being read. Diane leaned over. He's toast, she murmured. Janet sipped her tea. Ice clinked. Then she looked at Richard one last time. I hope you're ready, she said. Because the next move isn't mine anymore. It's the government's. Richard opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Janet's phone rang. Unknown number, again. She answered. A clipped voice spoke fast and low. Ms. Kessler, this is Special Agent Tatum with the Inspector General's office. Your name just came up in Greg Mercer's sealed deposition. We need to talk. Now. Janet froze. Let me be clear, Harold said over speakerphone, his voice crisp against the hum of the box fan in Janet's sunroom. Greg Mercer does not have a leg to stand on. Janet sat at her garden table, sorting through a bin of old hand tools, gloves, pruning shears, a rusted trowel that hadn't seen daylight in years. The spring soil was still cold, but she'd already decided this was the year she'd replant the hydrangeas, something to fill the silence between subpoenas. He claims I signed a non-disclosure, she said, wiping a blade clean with a rag. Forged or not, doesn't that give him something to lean on? Not anymore, Harold replied. Tatum got it tossed. Signature doesn't match your HR documents. And Richard corroborated that Greg handled those files solo. It's already logged as part of the obstruction pattern. Janet dropped a pair of cracked gardening gloves into a trash bag and exhaled, slow and steady. She wasn't celebrating. She was just settling. Like a ship righting itself after a long list to port. Appreciate the update, she said. Stay the course, Harold added. We're weeks, maybe days, from a full administrative review. They're stacking violations like firewood. Janet ended the call. A cardinal landed on the fence post beside the compost bin, its red feathers sharp against the grays and browns of late winter. It chirped once, then fluttered off. Inside the house, Diane leaned against the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand. So, she said, grinning. No courtroom showdown? I was this close to sewing you a power suit. Janet smirked. Maybe save it for sentencing. I was thinking Navy. Something that says, I never raised my voice, but now I own your future. Janet chuckled softly and stood, wiping her palms on her jeans. He's not going to sue. He never was. Of course not, Diane said. Greg's the type who throws a punch after the bell, then claims it was strategy. By the time Janet came back inside and set the gloves on the washer, her phone was already buzzing with new notifications. One from LinkedIn. Greg had posted again. Loyalty used to mean something. Now it's just a word people hide behind when they stab you in the back. Shameful. A photo attached showed him seated on a rooftop terrace, drink in hand. The caption, She leadership under fire. True colors. Janet didn't click like this time. But she did notice something in the comments, dozens of them. Some congratulatory, sure, but many more laced with hesitation. Questions. What happened with the HR inquiry? Heard rumors about a doll probe? True? Wasn't Janet Kessler your team lead for 20 years? And one from Richard Holmes. Not subtle, not hidden. Sometimes silence enables rot. Speaking up doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you late. Janet stared at that line for a long time, not because it surprised her, but because of how measured it was, how final. Richard was drawing the line publicly. Diane saw it too. Well, well, the spreadsheet ghost grows a spine. He doesn't want to be on the wrong side of history, Janet said. Or subpoena, Diane muttered. That night, Janet drove across town to the community center. The parking lot was half filled with old pickups and compact sedans, the snow from last week already melted to slush around the drains. Inside, the multipurpose room was warm, humming with laughter and the low rustle of fabric. The Tuesday night quilting group had grown since she last attended. Maybe 16 women now, all clustered at long tables with thread kits, rotary cutters, and thick stacks of flannel. Janet took her seat quietly, pulling a pale blue square from her tote and pinning it to the growing pattern of her piece. A calm, geometric storm of navy, gray, and ivory. "You're back," said Myra from across the table. "Been a while." Janet smiled. "Had some things to stitch together first." Laughter. Light. Normal. For 2 hours she didn't think about Greg, or the deposition, or the next hearing. She just sewed. But when she got home, a padded envelope was waiting on her doorstep. No return address, no postage, just her name, scrawled in all caps, in Greg Mercer's handwriting. Janet saw him the moment she pulled the blinds back. Greg, standing at the edge of her porch in a wrinkled dress shirt and slacks that looked slept in. His tie hung loose, like a noose he hadn't figured out how to tighten. His face was red, flushed not from the cold but from whatever storm had been building behind his eyes since the truth started leaking. She didn't move. He stepped up to the door and pounded twice. "Janet." No answer. Another knock, harder this time. "I know you're in there." She stayed perfectly still, her heartbeat steady. Her cell phone was already recording from the kitchen counter. She'd turned it on the second she saw his car crawl up her street. "Come out here," Greg shouted. "You want to destroy me? At least have the guts to look me in the eye when you do it." She moved to the side window, careful not to be seen, and peeked through the curtain. 2 of her neighbors had stepped onto their porches. One of them, Mrs. Townsend, was holding her phone to her ear. Good. Across the street, Diane sat behind the wheel of her Subaru, her phone pointed directly at Greg. The engine was still running. Greg pounded on the glass again. "You think you're so clever, huh? Filing anonymous complaints, hiding behind lawyers. I built that office. You'd still be pushing paper in a shared cubicle if it weren't for me." Janet crossed her arms, resting them on the back of a kitchen chair. Calm. Composed. Like a courtroom stenographer who'd seen every breakdown before. Greg glanced back, saw people watching, and raised his voice further. "You're not going to win. You think the government gives a damn about your hurt feelings? About old HR memos from 5 years ago? I was cleaning up messes, Janet. That's what leaders do." She didn't blink. She let him yell. Let him scramble. Let him burn through what was left of his composure. That's when the sirens approached. Greg turned, confused for a second, like he couldn't believe anyone had actually called the cops on him. Then the flashing reds and blues reflected off the windows of Janet's house, painting his figure in flickering bursts of consequence. A cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb. 2 officers stepped out. 1 male, 1 female, both in standard patrol blues. Diane exited her car, holding up her phone. "I've got the whole thing," she said, calm as ever. He was pounding on the door, screaming threats. Janet opened the door then, not all the way, just enough to be heard. "I never invited him here," she said clearly. "He came unannounced. He's been threatening me for weeks." The female officer gave a short nod. "We've got it on video now, ma'am. You're safe." Greg turned toward the officers, incredulous. "This is ridiculous. She's weaponizing her retirement like a lawsuit." "Sir, I need you to step off the porch," the male officer said. Greg didn't move. "You're escalating a harassment complaint," the officer added, firmer now. "Let's not turn this into something more." Janet watched Greg's jaw tighten, watched the realization settle into his face that the Greg Mercer charm wasn't working anymore. Not on anyone. He stepped back, 1 foot, then the other. The female officer gestured toward the cruiser. We're going to take a statement downtown. Greg didn't argue. He didn't shout again. He just turned and walked, slow and heavy, like a man who knew the cameras had finally turned on him, and they weren't blinking. As they pulled away, Diane walked up the steps. Well, she said, slipping her phone back into her coat pocket. That went about as well as I hoped. Janet nodded once. It's always loudest right before it breaks. They stood in the quiet for a moment. No more sirens, no more yelling. Just wind, and the creak of the porch beneath their boots. Inside, Janet's phone buzzed. 1. New voicemail. Harold Gutman. She tapped play. Janet, just got the update from Tatum. That little stunt Greg pulled? It just cemented the retaliation case. We're moving forward on federal charges, internals folding, fast. You're about to get the kind of apology they write checks for. Janet set the phone down. I'll make tea, she said, turning back inside. But just as she crossed the threshold, the landline, her rarely used, almost forgotten landline, began to ring. She turned to Diane, who raised a brow. Janet picked it up. Hello? The voice on the other end was quiet, gravelly. If you think Greg's the only one who made deals behind closed doors, you're not as smart as you think. Click. Dial tone. The downtown office smelled like old paper, fresh ink, and final decisions. Harold's new paralegal offered Janet a bottle of water as she stepped into the conference room, but she waved it off with a polite smile. She didn't want water. She wanted closure. Diane was already seated at the far end of the table, legs crossed, a proud little smirk on her face like she'd been waiting years for this appointment. Harold entered seconds later, binder under one arm and a manila envelope in the other. Morning, ladies, he said, setting both down with the weight of finality. I just got off the phone with the Office of Administrative Hearings. They're greenlighting the settlement terms. Janet sat, smoothing the sleeves of her navy cardigan. How much are they offering? Harold slid a single sheet across the table. Mid-six figures, 2 tranches, front-loaded with a non-disparagement clause, though not aimed at you. It's them trying to save face. Janet didn't reach for the paper. Instead, she pulled a smaller envelope from her purse and set it gently on top. I want the full award redirected, she said. No press, no tax shield, no headlines. Harold paused. Redirected where? Safe Haven Women's Shelter, Janet said. Downtown, the one that lost funding last fall. They had to turn away 7 people the night after Thanksgiving. Harold blinked once. You understand what you're waiving? Janet finally met his eyes. I do. He opened the manila folder and pulled out the release form. You sure you don't want a portion? Just a stipend? Janet shook her head. What I needed wasn't money. Diane snorted softly. She needed fire and a reason to use it. Janet smiled. Now I want the ashes to warm somebody else. Harold slid the paperwork closer. Then let's make it official. The pen clicked in her hand with quiet finality. Each signature looped cleaner than the last, no hesitation, no edits, just ink and intent. When she finished, Harold took the papers and walked them to the scanner near the door. The machine beeped 3 times, confirming receipt. 1 copy to legal, 1 to records, 1 to the Department of Labor, and 1, Janet's, sealed and handed to her in a heavy blue folder. You're clear, he said. You won. She stood slowly, slipping the folder into her bag. No, she said. We did. Diane rose too, eyes glinting. Hell of a retirement party, huh? Janet laughed, genuinely this time. They stepped into the hallway, and for the first time in months, her footsteps felt light. No more waiting for calls. No more folders under her bed. No more scanning every unknown number like it might be a threat. Just air, cold and clean. As they exited the building, the wind pulled at Janet's scarf. She looked up, the gray clouds breaking just enough for one sliver of sun to cut through, warming the concrete steps in front of them. A symbolic beam, if you were the kind to believe in such things. They weren't, but it was nice anyway. "Lunch?" Diane asked, already tugging out her keys. "Diner," Janet replied. "Pie's on me this time." The bell above Murphy's Diner jingled as they walked in. The smell of bacon grease and cinnamon toast filled the air. Carla, the same waitress who'd served Janet since 003, looked up from the counter and beamed. "There she is," Carla said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You back for good?" Janet smiled and nodded. "No more paperwork, no more inboxes, just pie." Carla walked around the counter and hugged her. Tight. Real. "You made a lot of us proud, Janet." Diane gave a low whistle. "If you start crying, I'm calling the news." "Let them come," Janet said, easing into their usual booth. "I'll serve them coffee." Carla laughed and scribbled their usual order onto a pad. As they waited, Diane pulled out her phone and passed it across the table. "Greg just posted again?" Janet hesitated, then took the phone. Greg's latest post was barely coherent. All caps. Misspelled words, accusations, rambling. Something about conspiracies, disloyalty, corruption. But what stood out wasn't the words. It was the likes. Barely a dozen. And one comment. Anonymous. Untraceable. "Check who else signed your promotions, Greg. You were never the only one rigging the game." Janet's smile faded just slightly. She handed the phone back. "What?" Diane asked, squinting. "Something wrong?" Janet took a deep breath and folded her hands around her coffee cup. "Turns out the rot wasn't just him," she said. And somewhere, far away, a bigger truth was waking up. The email came just after sunrise. Janet was out back, kneeling in the garden bed beside the fence, loosening winter-packed soil with a small claw rake. Her gloves were damp. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and thawing pine mulch. Cardinals darted along the fence line, quiet witnesses. Her phone buzzed in the canvas pocket of her gardening apron. From Harold Gutman. Subject: termination confirmed. She stood, brushing her knees, and opened it with gloved fingers smudged in dirt. "It's official. Mercer's been terminated for cause. Full benefits revoked. Compliance board vote was unanimous. The Office of Inspector General has completed their findings. Case is now part of a joint DOJ inquiry. Possible federal charges pending. You started something bigger than you realized, Janet. Let's talk soon." Janet stared at the screen for a long moment, her breath curling in the cold morning air. Then she lowered the phone and knelt back down, digging her fingers into the soil like it was something she finally owned again. Tulip bulbs, ivory, plum, coral, waited in a shallow basket beside her. She began placing them one by one, smooth side up, 3 inches apart. Like Harold had taught her once, long ago, in a life before depositions and burner phones. By mid-morning, the bulbs were in the ground, and Greg Mercer no longer had a job. Later, over lunch, Diane slammed her glass of sweet tea against the diner table with theatrical flair. "To the downfall of dragons," she declared. "May their fire die cold and stupid." Janet raised her coffee mug in response. "And to dirt. Literal and metaphorical." Carla, beaming behind the counter, emerged carrying a pie tin cradled in a dish towel like a newborn. "I made this just for you," she said, setting it down carefully. "Peach blackberry crumble. I figured it's the kind of flavor that says freedom." Janet laughed, full, unguarded. "That might be the most Southern sentence I've heard all year." Diane grabbed a fork. "I love it when justice comes with whipped cream." They dug in. Carla lingered at the booth longer than usual. "Word's gotten around," she said gently. "You know, what you did. People talk. But for once, they're saying the right things. Janet wiped her hands with a napkin. It wasn't just me. No, Carla said, but you were the one who didn't flinch. That afternoon, Janet found herself walking the long hallway of the local municipal building, heels echoing off waxed tile. She passed faded photographs of city councilors from decades past until she reached the third-floor conference room. Richard was already waiting inside. His suit was pressed, but he looked smaller than she remembered. Like a man living an apology. "I heard," he said quietly as she entered. Janet closed the door behind her. "I'm not here to gloat." "I know." He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Can I say something first?" Janet sat, folding her hands in her lap. "Go ahead." "I let you down," Richard said. "I let a lot of people down. I thought if I stayed quiet, I'd keep my job. My pension. My peace." He looked up, eyes glassy. "But none of it felt like mine anymore." Janet nodded slowly. "And now?" "I told the internal investigators everything," he said. "Timeline, messages, side emails. Even the promotion strings Greg pulled for that Boston client's nephew." Janet blinked. That detail hadn't come up before. "That'll help," she said. "More than you know." He reached into his briefcase and slid a small box across the table. "This was yours. I found it cleaning out the archives." Inside sat her old nameplate, Janet Kessler, Senior OPS Coordinator. The brass had dulled, but the engraving was still sharp. She ran a thumb over it, then closed the lid gently. "You're not going to frame it?" Richard asked, half hopeful. "No," she said. "I don't need titles anymore." That evening, as the sun dipped low and pink across the horizon, Janet walked barefoot through the garden. The soil had settled. The tulips were invisible beneath the surface, waiting. She could feel them there, though, like quiet promises. Diane came out with 2 glasses of wine. "You planting anything else?" "Maybe daffodils," Janet said. "Or something wild that doesn't ask permission." They stood in silence for a while, watching a pair of birds land on the fence and preen without urgency. Diane raised her glass. "To freedom." Janet clinked hers gently. "To knowing it when you feel it." Her phone buzzed again. One last alert. Anonymous comment. New activity on Greg's last post. Ask who signed off on Phoenix East contracts. The rot goes deeper than Mercer. And some of us aren't sleeping anymore. Janet lowered her phone slowly. "Trouble?" Diane asked. Janet's gaze stayed fixed on the screen. "Not for me," she said quietly. Then she walked inside and flipped open the drawer where she kept her spare recorder. Something was still breathing in the dark, and Janet was not done listening. The news broke mid-morning. Janet was elbow-deep in dish soap, humming quietly to herself as the sun streamed through her kitchen window. The scent of lemon cleaner hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of toast crumbs and the warmth of an old house awake for the day. The television was on in the background, volume low, just noise, really. Until she heard it. Former regional executive Greg Mercer has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, following a cascade of legal proceedings tied to whistleblower retaliation and financial misconduct. She didn't stop scrubbing the pan. Just reached for a towel, dried her hands, and turned the volume up 1 notch. Mercer's assets, including 2 properties and a limited stake in Mercer and Lane Consultants, are frozen pending investigation. Legal experts suggest criminal charges may follow. The anchor didn't even sound surprised. Janet clicked the TV off. There was no thrill, no fist pump, just a long, steady exhale, like breathing out the last bit of someone else's storm. She turned back to the counter and began wiping it clean, humming again. Same tune, same rhythm. An hour later, her inbox pinged. From Richard Holmes. Subject: Re. Closure. "Janet, I saw the filing. I won't lie. It feels strange watching him unravel in real time, but I've deleted his number, unfollowed every account. I'm not defending anything else. Thank you for forcing the mirror up, even when I didn't want to look. I'm applying for a compliance officer role at a nonprofit in Austin. Something clean. Something I can believe in again. No need to respond. Just wanted you to know. Janet read it twice, then archived it without replying. Some goodbyes don't need words. The doorbell rang at 11. Diane. She came bearing 2 coffees, black for Janet, cinnamon oat milk nonsense for herself, and a paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries. You here? She said, stepping inside like she owned the square footage. TV beat you to it, Janet replied, taking her cup. They settled in at the breakfast table. Sunlight spilled across the tiles. Somewhere outside, someone was mowing a lawn too early in the season, but Janet didn't mind. The world was moving again. He's bankrupt, Diane said, shaking her head. God. I thought he'd die clutching stock options. Janet sipped. He might still. Just in a rental. Diane grinned, then pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket. This came for you at the diner. Janet opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, the edges embossed with faint lilac blossoms. Safe Haven, Women's Shelter. Dear Ms. Kessler, your contribution didn't just help us reopen our doors, it kept 4 families off the street this month. We wanted you to know that one mother said she'd named her newborn daughter Grace because she thought it was the only word big enough for what had saved her. Thank you for making space for hope. With deep gratitude, the Safe Haven team. Janet ran her thumb across the raised lettering. Her fingers lingered at the word Grace. Diane watched her carefully. That's why you did it, isn't it? I didn't do it for her, Janet said quietly. But I'm glad she's okay. They sat a while in silence, finishing their coffee. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Later that day, Janet opened the last cabinet she hadn't touched in years. Old binders, retirement cards, office birthday decorations no one had ever bothered to hang. At the very back sat a shoebox marked simply, personal. Inside were half-used notepads, a dozen corporate pens, and a single photo. Her and Diane, arms slung around each other at a company picnic. Greg, blurred in the background, mid-laugh. She took the photo out and tore it in half, discarding the background. The part that mattered, the real part, she pinned to the fridge. As twilight painted the sky in amber streaks, Janet walked out to the garden. The soil had started to crack in places, tiny shoots pushing through where the tulips had been buried. She knelt beside the first green bud and touched it gently. Not all things bloom in spring. Some bloom in spite of it. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't check it right away. Instead, she walked slowly back to the house, poured herself a glass of water, and flipped through a recipe book her mother had once given her. Apple cake. Maybe she'd bake tomorrow. Maybe she wouldn't. The phone buzzed again. Finally, she picked it up. Unknown number voicemail received. She played it on speaker as she rinsed her glass. Ms. Kessler, this is Special Agent Tatum. I'm reaching out because your name just came up again. This time tied to Phoenix East. We're uncovering doctored financials that go back further than we thought. I know you've done your part, but I think the storm's just beginning. Click. Janet turned off the faucet. Outside, wind rattled the branches. Not hard, not violent. Just enough to say, pay attention. She dried her hands on a dish towel and looked toward the drawer where her recorder lived. Then, softly, she smiled. So be it. The roses had finally come in. Thick with color and scent, they climbed the trellis Janet had repainted last fall. Soft pinks and deep crimsons tangled in blooms so rich they looked like they'd been painted by hand. She wore her straw sun hat tilted low, gloved fingers coaxing a stubborn vine into place as the warm wind danced across the porch. There were bees in the air, the good kind, the kind that kept the world alive. She stepped back and surveyed the row. Nothing wild, nothing grand. But hers. Behind her, the screen door creaked. "You know," Diane called, "you're getting dangerously close to living in a Hallmark movie." Janet turned just in time to catch the coffee mug tossed underhanded. "Careful," she said, catching it with both hands. "This porch has witnessed many crimes." Diane smirked, barefoot and grinning in cut-off jeans and a t-shirt that read, "Retired but still dangerous." "Yeah, and now it gets to witness joy," she said, flopping into the wicker chair beside the flower bed. They sat like that for a while, mug in hand, breeze in their hair, cicadas beginning to warm up somewhere beyond the fence. No subpoenas, no screaming voicemails, just the kind of morning people forgot to want until they'd fought for it. At noon, Carla showed up in her white sedan, windows down, radio blaring something swingy from the 50s. She popped the trunk dramatically and produced a pastry box the size of a television. "I brought reinforcements," she declared, setting the box on the porch railing like it was a ceremonial offering. Diane peeked inside. "Is that—" "Yep," Carla said, already removing the lid. "Mini pecan pies, lemon bars, and cinnamon rolls. Half price at the bakery this morning. I told them I was delivering them to a local legend, and the kid at the register gave me an extra brownie." Janet laughed and opened the screen door. "Then you better come inside before we crown you." "Do I get a title?" Carla asked, stepping over the threshold. "You're the Duchess of Dough," Diane said, effective immediately. That afternoon, a white envelope arrived with the day's mail, tucked between a garden supply catalog and a coupon for tire rotation. The return address was scrawled in Harold's careful, upright print. Inside, a holiday card, snowy pines on the front. Inside, a short note. "Janet, I hope peace is the only thing in your inbox this year. You made more than a case. You made space for truth. Warmly, Harold Gutman." Janet read it once, then pinned it to the side of the fridge with the magnet shaped like a red tomato. It sat next to the thank you letter from Safe Haven. This time, she noticed the footer. "The Collins Fund, in memory of women who stayed too quiet for too long." Janet blinked once. She hadn't chosen that name, but she smiled. By evening, the sun was settling low, casting gold light across the floorboards of the back porch. Janet stood with a watering can in one hand, watching the roses shift in the wind like they were dancing to something only they could hear. The kitchen radio played low. Something old. Something twangy. Behind her, Diane was cleaning up crumbs from their third round of pastries. Carla had already left to pick up her grandkid, but not before promising to return with scones and scandal. The house smelled like lemon bars and garden dirt. Janet stepped off the porch, her bare feet sinking slightly into the cool soil. She poured water slowly over the roots of her newest plant, something she'd planted just last week. Not because it was practical, but because it was beautiful. She bent down, brushed a fallen petal from the mulch. Then she stood, straightened, and breathed. It wasn't the deep breath of someone recovering. It was the full breath of someone arriving. Behind her, Diane called out, "Want to drive up to the lake this weekend? I heard the herons are nesting." Janet turned with a lazy grin. "Only if I get to bring pie." "That's a threat," Diane said. "And I accept." They both laughed. No shadows, no secrets. Not anymore. Janet glanced toward the mailbox again, half expecting one last shoe to drop. But nothing came. Just birdsong. And roses. And a life she hadn't won exactly, but one she'd refused to surrender. She reached into the basket beside the door, pulled out her small black recorder, and slipped it quietly into a drawer lined with note cards and thread. Locked it. Then left the key in the sunlight. Some storms you survive. Some storms you finish. Janet Kessler had done both. And now she kept the life she'd rebuilt. One bloom at a time. One day that was hers, and hers alone.